Hi everyone, welcome to our first lecture. What I recommend if you're starting this whole week's material with the lecture is that you stop right now and you complete the reading first. I think in an ideal world, the first thing that you do for the week is complete all of our textbook readings. From there, I would take a look at the weekly response prompt as well as the primary source discussion prompt to get an idea for the types of things I'm hoping you look for. I'm also hoping that when you read, you took a few notes. And because it's week one, and I don't think everyone has necessarily the same background in note-taking, I've provided my own notes from reading the chapter in the week one module. You can find those under the title Guided Notes for week number one. I'm not going to provide these every week, but I think to give us all a firm basis on what good notes look like, I'm going to give you mine from this chapter. So I hope as you read, you're taking your own notes and then you take a moment to compare them with mine. Each week I'll provide you with at least one lecture, probably a few more, that are meant to fill the gaps. So I'm not going to cover everything in the reading, but I want to fill some gaps where I think that there could be a bit more explanation. I'm also going to try to do a little bit of summarizing for you so that you're a little bit more clear on what the textbook is trying to get across. So we're starting with chapter 13, week one, which I believe is the first chapter in the fourth part of the larger textbook. The year 1500 serves as a kind of nice starting point. Scholars debate a lot of dates and about which date is important and why. But there are a lot of scholars who say, modern history, a history that this class is supposed to look at, modern global history, really begins around the year 1500. Now, more accurately, it's probably right to note it started modern history, started in different places at different times. But if we're just going to try to give a collective year, the year 1500 is a nice little bookend to say, okay, well, this is where modern history starts. And the reason for that is because around the year 1500, right, the beginning of the 16th century, around the beginning of the 16th century, you have the creation of global empires. And many of these global empires that begin around 1500 are going to last straight through the 20th century. So modern history is really defined around these global empires, and that's why chapter 13, the beginning of the fourth part of this book, is going to start you off in the year 1500. So what I want to do in these three lectures that I'm providing you is give you a little roadmap. We're looking specifically to recognize patterns. So that is, what do these global empires, even though they're different, right? The Western European powers that build Atlantic empires, the Russians, the Chinese Qin dynasty, the Mughals in India, and the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and in Southeastern Europe. What do these empires have in common? They practice, to some extent, very similar forms of empire building. Of course, as the also subtitle recognizes, there are clear differences between how these empires were built and the things that these empires emphasized. So week one, I called it Global Empires. We're looking at roughly 1500 to 1700. We'll have some overlap in our time frames as we look at different things, but we're interested in recognizing patterns and identifying differences. And I'll give you all the time guiding questions to follow as I'm presenting these materials. And you'll notice I have 3 lectures posted, so I have 1 question for each of these lectures. I'll post these slides as PowerPoints, as PDFs for you. But you'll notice that most of my slides are images and some text, so you don't feel the need to necessarily download those and save them all, although you can if you'd like. I think what you should do is be taking notes through this lecture that augment your reading notes or add to the notes you took from when you're reading. So this first part of our lecture, right, the first of 3 for this week, for week number 1, empire building, we're going to look at the Atlantic empires. Now, I've provided a map for you. This is global history. So as far as geographic space goes, we bounce around a lot. And that has some pros and cons. For those of you who are in American schools, one thing I know is that they don't necessarily do a good job teaching geography. There's plenty of maps in the textbook, so I really recommend you to use those. Also, you're on computers, Google things you don't know. Geographic space is very important to understanding this course. So I'll always try to orient us both chronologically, what time periods we're talking about, and geographically, where we're talking about. So you'll notice when I'm talking about Atlantic empires, we're going to talk a little bit about Western Europe. So you can see that box to the upper right. Western Europe, specifically the kingdoms of Spain, France, and what becomes Great Britain, which is England at this time. And then we're going to talk about the empires they built on the other side of the Atlantic, mostly in Central and South America, but we'll also touch on North America a little bit. And our driving question for understanding the Atlantic empires is why? Why did the powers of Western Europe cross the Atlantic to build these new empires, right? And how did they do that? I'm sure we're all familiar because I believe most of us went to school in the United States. We know about Columbus, we know about exploration, but we don't really know as much as we think we do. You know, why did Columbus sail west? Well, you would be like, oh, because he knew the world was round. Well, newsflash, everyone at the time, for the most part, especially if you're a sailor, knew the world was round. So Columbus isn't this revolutionary who knew the world was round. Instead, he underestimated the size of it and believed that you could sail west to get to the Far East, to get to China, to India, much more quickly than would be possible. He's saved, because he's wrong, by the fact that there are two massive continents in his way. But that doesn't really explain why the Europeans were so interested in colonization. So we'll look at what drove them there, and then we'll talk a little bit about how they built their empires and similarities and differences between them. So we have to rewind a little bit before 1500 if we're going to really understand what drove Europeans into the Atlantic. And a major turning point in world history, European history more specifically, was the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So if you see this little map that I made, you know, these kingdoms are totally inaccurate for 1500, by the way. This map comes from, I believe, the 13th century, so from the 1200s. But it's useful for us to kind of recognize what Europe had looked like prior to 1453. Constantinople was kind of this last vestige. You can see it right in there. I've got it circled and part of the Byzantine Empire. It was the last vestige of the Roman Empire. It had been another capital of Rome once Rome had conquered the world. And what was so important about Constantinople was that it served an economic linchpin. It connected trade routes that stretched all the way into India and China, right, to the Far East, with consumers in Europe. And where you can see this kind of most visibly demonstrated was during the Renaissance. You know, this tremendous amount of wealth that was accumulated mostly in Italy and then spread out into Europe, into France, to Spain, and some of it getting up to England as well. The huge amount of wealth that was concentrated in the Italian city-states. There is no nation of Italy. Instead, there's these smaller city-states. But they were able to accumulate so much wealth through banks and through traders because they were taking products like spices, silks, gold, and all sorts of other jewels that were coming in from the Middle East, right? From the Far East through the Middle East into Europe. And then they were able to also sell back manufactured products from Western Europe to the Middle East and to the Far East. So there's really a linchpin of this economic system existed in the city of Constantinople because it connected West and East. Now the problem is in 1453, Constantinople is captured by the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks. Western Europeans saw the Turks. Remember, they had been fighting the Crusades against the Turks up through 1453. They saw the Ottoman Turks as foreign invaders. They saw them as heathens. They didn't recognize kind of any cultural or religious similarities between the two. So the fall of the Byzantine Empire signaled for Western Europe an end to an era, right? No longer was this kind of flow of goods from east to west going to just be facilitated by traders in the Byzantine Empire and from Italy. And so what you have is a really dramatic shift in power. After 1453, the Mediterranean world, which had dominated European history, I mean, think back to the Roman Empire, right? Rome was so lucrative because it sat right smack in the middle on the Italian peninsula of the Mediterranean world, right? It was a perfect stopping point between Gaul, which is, modern Spain, and the Levant, or the Middle East. It's directly in between the two. And so it was able to orient this power, this economic power in the Mediterranean world for so long. But the fall of Constantinople meant that that Mediterranean world was no longer viable. There was a foreign power in the eyes of Westerners who controlled considerable amounts of that Mediterranean world. And so there's a shift, a tremendous shift in economic and political power from the Mediterranean, right? From places like the Italian peninsula over to the Western empires because of their geography. Spain, France, Great Britain, all of them located on the Atlantic, which could now launch trading routes around Africa and to India to get those same materials and bring them back to Europe, which meant instead of kind of this accumulation of wealth occurring in Italy, it was now occurring in Spain or in Portugal, which were the first kind of two exploring nations to sail around Africa. But there's another kind of tremendous event that happens that really propels Spain ahead of its neighbor Portugal to the head of this exploration process. And it happens in that same year, in 1492, that Columbus sets sail. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella are going to unite two powerful crowns of the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain is located, and finally drive out the Moors. The Moors were seen as foreign invaders. They had come from North Africa. They had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula, and they had conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, all the way actually into the border with France, where they're defeated at the Battle of Tours by a Frenchman. But they occupied a tremendous amount of space in the Iberian Peninsula. And King Ferdinand and Isabella are the culmination of a centuries-long battle to drive the Moors, these foreign invaders, out of the Iberian Peninsula. And in 1492, they finally expel the last Moors from Granada, which is, you can see, in southern Spain. And so they reunite, right? They conquer Spain. And this gives them a tremendous access to wealth that they're able to reinvest. These wars are now over. The Moors have been driven out. We need new places to invest our money. Let's invest it in exploration. And they fund Columbus's voyage west to the Orient that was unsuccessful, but successful in something else. It discovered, quote unquote, discovered there were people living there, but it discovered the Americas. And so this is going to catapult Spain to tremendous amounts of power for centuries. They're going to rack up tremendous amount of wealth from the exploitation of native peoples in the Americas. But it brings us to the other side of the Atlantic, where we have to begin talking about these Atlantic empires. So we'll talk a lot about New Spain, and we'll talk about the Caribbean, and we'll juxtapose the Spanish Empire with French, Portuguese, and eventually English empires in the New World. Most of our focus will be on Latin America, South America. We'll talk briefly about North America, but really kind of the heart of colonialization wasn't in what becomes the United States. When Plymouth or Jamestown are founded in the 17th century, in the 1600s, they're outposts. The colonial world is thriving, but it's thriving in the Caribbean. It's thriving on the Latin American peninsulas there, right? It's not located in North America. So we'll spend most of our time talking about the Spanish, the Portuguese, and what's going on in the Caribbean. So New Spain is a fascinating colonial process. Most of us are familiar with what the English did. That is, they moved large populations from the British Isles to the New World, mostly beggars and the poor, by the way, from the British Isles to the New World. Spain wasn't interested in doing that. They didn't want to move Iberian people to the New World. Instead, they wanted to conquer large swaths of land and exploit the native people for resources. And so what that means is that they have to rely on an intermarriage process between peninsulares, so if you see our social pyramid up there, peninsulares, people born in Spain, with indigenous people. And so what you have in New Spain is a society of mixed race people, right? At the top of the society were peninsulares, people from Spain. However, just below them were people who were also from the descendants of people from Spain of pure Spanish descendancy. But below them, and perhaps the largest group, were these mestizos, who were people of mixed Spanish and indigenous blood. And you can see that picture right down there of clearly a Spaniard man with either an indigenous woman or a mestizo woman and their child. So unlike in the British colonies, you have the mixing of races that creates New Spain. Spain is also going to make a tremendous amount of wealth from a mountain that was pretty much made of silver called Potosí. Perhaps you've read legends about these, Spanish treasure chests that are buried across the Atlantic in places, and you're like, where did Spain get all this money? Well, part of the answer is that they got it from Potosí, which is a mountain that was pretty much made entirely of silver. And this silver was traded across the entire world, as far as China, and it made the Spanish tremendously wealthy. And so these Spanish mines that mine things like silver at places like Potosí were manned by the indigenous people. If I go back a moment, you can see that enslaved people, some of them being African, some of them being indigenous, were at the bottom of society. So I'm going to stop there for one because I've got a 15-minute time limit on these videos. We'll come back and get to the rest of this lecture at the beginning of lecture number 2.